August 15th, 1945. Osaka. The air hung thick with the smoke of 1,000 smoldering ruins, acrid and bitter on the tongue. Captain Hiroshi Tanaka pressed his palm against the makeshift bandage wrapped around his abdomen, feeling the warm seep of blood through the threadbare cotton. The wound was 3 days old. Shrapnel from an American artillery shell that had torn through his position during the final, desperate defense of the city's outskirts. He'd expected to die then. He'd wanted to die then, as his emperor had commanded, as honor demanded. But his body had betrayed him, clinging stubbornly to life, even as his comrades fell around him like cherry blossoms in a storm. Now, slumped against the rubble of what had once been a residential street, Hiroshi watched through fevered eyes as foreign soldiers approached. Americans, the enemy, the demons his government had spent 4 years describing in the most horrific terms imaginable. They would torture him, certainly, mutilate him, perhaps eat his organs, as the propaganda posters had suggested, with grotesque illustrations. His hand moved instinctively to the cyanide capsule sewn into the lining of his torn uniform jacket. Better a clean death than what awaited. But something was wrong with this picture. The Americans weren't advancing with weapons raised. They weren't shouting or kicking through the debris with the fury of conquerors. They were walking carefully, almost gently, their faces creased, not with rage but with something Hiroshi's fever-addled mind couldn't quite identify. Concern, pity, impossible. The lead soldier, a man so tall he seemed to Hiroshi like a mythological giant, knelt down slowly, hands visible and empty. Quozo. The American said in a language Hiroshi didn't understand, though the tone was unmistakable. Soft, careful, the way one might approach a wounded animal. Hiroshi's fingers fumbled for the cyanide capsule. In the summer of 1945, the Japanese civilian population had been prepared for apocalypse. For nearly 4 years, the machinery of the imperial government had churned out a relentless stream of propaganda, each poster more lurid than the last, each radio broadcast more apocalyptic. Americans were depicted as subhuman monsters, as rapacious beasts who would violate every woman, murder every child, desecrate every sacred space. The propaganda was not merely exaggeration. It was calculated psychological warfare turned inward, designed to ensure that the Japanese population would fight to the last person, rather than surrender. In Tokyo, Kyoto, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and countless smaller cities, families had made their preparations. Mothers stockpiled rat poison and sharpened kitchen knives, preparing to kill their children and themselves rather than face capture. Fathers who were too old or too injured to fight nonetheless gathered what weapons they could. Bamboo spears, farming implements, anything that might be used in a final, futile resistance. Children were drilled in suicide tactics, taught that death in the emperor's service was the highest honor, that survival in defeat was the deepest shame. The psychological impact of this sustained campaign of terror cannot be overstated. By August of 1945, after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, after Emperor Hirohito's unprecedented radio address announcing surrender, the Japanese population faced their imagined doom with a mixture of resignation, terror, and a strange sort of defiant pride. If they must die, they would die as Japanese, unbowed before the barbarian invader. But reality, as it so often does, had something else in mind. Hiroshi didn't remember losing consciousness. One moment he was staring up at the impossibly tall American soldier, his fingers still clutching the cyanide capsule, and the next he was waking up in motion, lying on something soft, a stretcher, being carried by hands that, to his infinite confusion, were being careful not to jostle him unnecessarily. The pain in his abdomen had gone from a sharp, burning agony to a dull, throbbing ache. Someone had given him morphine. The enemy had given him morphine. His eyes fluttered open. He was being carried through what had once been a commercial district, now reduced to skeletal remains of buildings and mountains of rubble. Other Japanese civilians, mostly women, elderly men, and children, lined the streets watching the American soldiers with expressions of abject terror. Some wept, some stood frozen, clearly expecting execution at any moment. A handful of younger men were being gathered into a group, and Hiroshi's drug-fogged mind assumed they were about to be shot. But no shots came. Instead, the Americans were sorting people. A medic, identifiable by the red cross on his helmet, was moving among the gathered civilians, checking them quickly but methodically. The wounded were being separated from the healthy. Field dressings were being applied. Water was being distributed from canteens. This wasn't possible. This wasn't what was supposed to happen. The stretcher bearers, two young American soldiers who couldn't have been more than 19 or 20 years old, carried Hiroshi to a field hospital that had been set up in the shell of a former department store. Inside, under canvas tarps stretched across the ruined ceiling, was a scene that would remain burned into Hiroshi's memory for the rest of his life. Americans and Japanese, wounded soldiers and wounded civilians, being treated side by side. No segregation, no hierarchy of suffering. A doctor approached. American, with wire-rimmed glasses and tired eyes that nonetheless sparked with focus when they landed on Hiroshi's abdomen. He said something in English to a Japanese interpreter, a young woman who looked as shell-shocked as Hiroshi felt. "The doctor says you have shrapnel in your abdominal cavity," she translated, her voice trembling. "It's causing internal bleeding. You need surgery immediately, or you'll die within 12 hours. Surgery. Immediate surgery. Not torture, not execution. Surgery." Hiroshi tried to speak, but his mouth was too dry. The interpreter seemed to understand anyway. "There are many wounded," she continued, translating the doctor's rapid explanation. Quote 4. "Within the hour, not after all the Americans were treated, not after days of languishing in a prisoner of war camp, untended and suffering, within the hour. The fever was making it hard to think, but Hiroshi managed to form words." Quote 5. The interpreter translated, and the American doctor's expression softened. When he replied, his voice carried a weariness that transcended language barriers. "Because that's what doctors do," the interpreter translated. "And because this war is over, what comes next is healing." Sergeant James Mitchell had enlisted in 1942, 3 months after Pearl Harbor, burning with rage and a thirst for vengeance that had sustained him through the brutal island-hopping campaigns of the Pacific Theater. He'd watched friends die at Guadalcanal, at Tarawa, at Iwo Jima, deaths that were ugly and senseless and screaming, deaths that left stains on his soul he wasn't sure would ever wash clean. He'd been trained to see the Japanese as an enemy so fanatical, so inhuman, that mercy was not merely unnecessary, but dangerous. And then, in a ruined suburb of Osaka, on August 18, 1945, a little girl with burns covering 30% of her body looked up at him with eyes that held the same terror he'd seen in his younger sister's face when she'd fallen through the ice on Miller's Pond back in Iowa. And something in James Mitchell broke and reformed simultaneously. She couldn't have been more than 6 years old. Her name, he would later learn, was Yuki, Snow. Someone had wrapped her burns in cloth that was more dirt than bandage, and she was shivering despite the summer heat, going into shock. Her mother sat beside her, holding the girl's hand, with a grip that spoke of desperate, hopeless love. The mother wasn't crying. She was beyond crying, locked in that terrible place where grief becomes simply another fact of existence. James had 2 choices. Walk past, focus on securing the area, follow his training that reminded him these people had cheered when Pearl Harbor burned, when American boys died on beaches and in jungles, or he could stop. He stopped, From his pack, James pulled out a field dressing, sterile, clean, American. He knelt down slowly, moving the way he'd learned to move around his niece back home. Non-threatening, gentle. The mother flinched, pulling her daughter closer, and James saw in her eyes the absolute certainty that he was about to kill them both. Instead, he held up the field dressing, then pointed at the little girl's burns, then back at the dressing. The universal language of help. The mother's expression didn't change, couldn't change, locked as it was in terror. But she didn't stop him when he carefully, with hands that had been trained to kill, now working to heal, began to apply the clean bandages to her daughter's ravaged skin. The little girl whimpered, and without thinking, James reached into his other pocket and pulled out his emergency ration chocolate bar. It was melted, misshapen from the heat and from being carried across the Pacific. But it was chocolate, real chocolate, the kind that American children took for granted and Japanese children hadn't seen in years, if ever. He broke off a small piece and held it out to the girl. She stared at it as if it were a talisman from another world. Slowly, with her mother's whispered permission, she took it, tasted it, and for just a moment, the pain in her eyes was replaced by wonder. The chocolate distribution began as individual acts of spontaneous compassion and evolved, within days, into official policy. General Douglas MacArthur, appointed Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers and tasked with overseeing the occupation of Japan, had arrived with a mandate that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. Not merely to defeat the Japanese, but to transform them. To turn a militaristic, emperor-worshipping society into a peaceful, democratic one. And MacArthur, for all his considerable ego and theatrical flair, understood something profound. You cannot win hearts through occupation alone. The statistics are staggering. Between September 1945 and the end of 1946, the United States military imported 3,500,000 tons of food supplies to Japan, a nation that had been their mortal enemy mere months before. 3,500,000 tons. Wheat, rice, powdered milk, canned meat, and yes, chocolate. Mountains of chocolate. More food than many Japanese had seen in the entire 4 years of war. Field kitchens were established in every major city. American soldiers, many of whom had lost friends and brothers to Japanese bullets and bayonets, found themselves serving hot meals to Japanese civilians. The cognitive dissonance was immense, but the orders were clear, and, slowly, grudgingly at first, then with increasing conviction, the soldiers complied. Sergeant Mitchell found himself assigned to one such kitchen in Osaka, ladling soup into bowls held by hands that shook with hunger and disbelief. The Japanese came tentatively at first, certain it was a trap, that the food was poisoned or that accepting it would somehow mark them for later persecution. But hunger is a powerful motivator, and gradually, the lines grew longer. On September 2, 1945, Mitchell watched as an elderly Japanese man, a man old enough to remember the Meiji Restoration, who had lived through the transformation of Japan from a feudal society to an industrial power, approached the serving line with his grandson, a boy of perhaps 8 years old. The old man's spine was rigid with pride and shame, his face a mask of stoic dignity that couldn't quite hide the desperation in his eyes. Mitchell filled 2 bowls with thick vegetable soup, then added an extra ladle to the boy's bowl. The old man noticed. Their eyes met. And in that moment, Mitchell saw the man's entire worldview crack and reform. The propaganda had promised monsters. Instead, he found a young man from Iowa, giving his grandson extra food. The old man bowed, not the shallow bow of politeness, but a deep bow, the kind reserved for profound gratitude. Mitchell, uncomfortable with the deference, bowed back, shallowly, awkwardly, but sincerely. The boy watched this exchange with wide eyes, holding his soup bowl as if it contained liquid gold. Captain Hiroshi Tanaka survived his surgery. The American doctor, a man named Theodore Simmons from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, removed 3 pieces of shrapnel from his abdominal cavity, repaired a perforated intestine, and quite literally saved his life. The operation took 4 hours. Afterward, as Hiroshi lay in a recovery area, alongside 2 American soldiers and 4 Japanese civilians, all wounded, all receiving the same level of care, he experienced a psychological rupture that would define the rest of his existence. Everything he had been taught was wrong. Not slightly wrong, not exaggerated, fundamentally, completely, catastrophically wrong. The Americans weren't demons, they were men. Young men, mostly, far from home, who seemed to take no pleasure in the suffering of their former enemies. Who, in fact, seemed determined to alleviate that suffering. The cognitive dissonance was physically painful. Hiroshi had spent 4 years preparing to die for his emperor, believing that death was preferable to the horrors of American capture. He had absorbed, internalized, and believed the propaganda so completely that it had become the foundation of his identity. And now that foundation was crumbling, leaving him adrift in a reality that made no sense according to the rules by which he'd lived his entire adult life. On his 3rd day of recovery, a young American soldier, Hiroshi later learned his name was Private Danny Rodriguez from Texas, brought him a canteen of water without being asked. Rodriguez had been wounded at Okinawa, had a long scar running down his left arm from a Japanese bayonet, and every reason to hate the man lying in the hospital bed. Instead, he smiled, a tired, genuine smile, and said something in English that Hiroshi didn't understand. The interpreter, making her rounds, translated, "He says you look like you're feeling better. He's glad. He says he's seen enough death." Hiroshi stared at this young American, this enemy soldier who had been taught to hate him just as thoroughly as he'd been taught to hate Americans, and felt something break loose in his chest. He began to weep, quietly, because even now, even in this moment of complete psychological dissolution, some habits of dignity remained. But the tears came, and they wouldn't stop. Private Rodriguez, misunderstanding, reached out and placed a hand on Hiroshi's shoulder. A gesture of comfort, of human connection, and Hiroshi wept harder, because kindness from one's enemy is sometimes more devastating than cruelty could ever be. The transformation of Japanese society didn't happen overnight, and it didn't happen smoothly. There were incidents, of course, violence, resistance, mutual suspicion. Some Japanese civilians, unable to process the contradiction between what they'd been told and what they were experiencing, committed suicide anyway. Some American soldiers, unable to move past their hatred, committed acts of brutality. The occupation was not a fairy tale, but the overwhelming trend, documented in thousands of letters, diary entries, military reports, and civilian testimonies, was toward something unprecedented in the history of warfare: reconciliation through deliberate, sustained acts of compassion. In Tokyo, American military administrators established school lunch programs that provided hot meals to hundreds of thousands of Japanese children. Many of these children had never known anything but wartime rationing, had grown up with hunger as a constant companion, had been taught to expect nothing from adults but demands for sacrifice. Now they lined up each day to receive rice balls, miso soup, and precious glasses of milk. Fresh milk, not the powdered substitute that had been their only option during the war. One such child was a boy named Kenji Yoshida, 8 years old in the autumn of 1945, living with his widowed mother in the ruins of eastern Tokyo. Kenji's father had died at Guadalcanal, his older brother at Iwo Jima. His mother worked 16 hours a day in a makeshift textile workshop, earning barely enough to keep them from starvation. Kenji himself was small for his age, malnourished, with the distended belly and stick-thin limbs that marked so many children of that era. The school lunch program changed Kenji's life in ways both physical and psychological. The food itself was transformative. Within 3 months, he'd gained 7 pounds, his energy returned, his ability to concentrate in school improved dramatically. But more than the nutrition, it was the experience of receiving food from Americans, these supposed monsters, that rewrote the operating system of his young mind. On November 3, 1945, an American soldier named Corporal William Hayes came to Kenji's school to help distribute lunches. Hayes was a big man, with hands the size of dinner plates and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. He'd been a boxer back in Detroit, had joined the Army after Pearl Harbor, had fought his way across the Pacific with a cold fury that made his commanding officers nervous. He looked, in short, exactly like the demons from the propaganda posters. But when Hayes ladled soup into Kenji's bowl, he smiled. Not a frightening smile, not a predatory smile, but the kind of smile an uncle might give a favorite nephew. And then, without any fanfare, Hayes pulled a chocolate bar from his pocket, a Hershey's bar, that iconic American candy, and placed it in Kenji's hand. Quote 9. Hayes said in English that Kenji didn't understand, but the gesture was clear. Kenji stared at the chocolate bar as if it were a religious artifact. He'd heard of chocolate, had seen it in pictures and books from before the war, but he'd never tasted it. Carefully, with trembling fingers, he unwrapped the brown paper and broke off a small square. The taste exploded in his mouth, sweet, rich, complex, unlike anything he'd ever experienced. It tasted, he thought with the peculiar wisdom of children, like happiness. That night, Kenji used a piece of charcoal and a scrap of paper to write a letter. His handwriting was crude, his vocabulary limited, but the message was clear. Dur Fon Chai, quote 10. He gave the letter to his teacher, who passed it to the American Administration Office, who eventually delivered it to Corporal Hayes. Hayes, this hard-bitten boxer from Detroit, who had killed more men than he cared to count, who had lost friends and brothers to Japanese bullets, who had every reason to remain locked in hatred, read that letter and wept. He kept it in his wallet for the rest of his life. When he died in 1987, at age 65, from a heart attack in his home in Michigan, that letter was still there. The paper worn thin from handling, the charcoal smudged but still legible. At his funeral, his daughter found it and asked her mother what it meant. Hayes's wife explained through her own tears that it was a reminder that even in the darkest times, even when hatred seems like the only rational response to horror, small acts of kindness can change the world. The medical intervention was perhaps even more transformative than the food distribution. American military doctors, nurses, and medics found themselves treating a population that was not merely wounded, but diseased, malnourished, and traumatized. Tuberculosis was rampant, dysentery killed thousands, vitamin deficiencies caused blindness, rickets, beriberi. The Japanese medical infrastructure had been decimated by the war, and the civilian population had been essentially abandoned by their own government in the final chaotic months of fighting. The Americans brought with them not just medical skill, but medical abundance: antibiotics, vitamins, vaccines, surgical equipment, anesthesia. They established clinics in every occupied area, staffed by personnel who worked 18-hour days, who struggled with language barriers and cultural differences, who often questioned the fairness of devoting such resources to former enemies, while American veterans back home struggled in understaffed VA hospitals. Dr. Elizabeth Morgan was one such medical professional. A surgeon from Boston, Massachusetts, she'd volunteered for military service in 1943, after her husband was killed at Normandy. She'd expected to spend the war treating American soldiers, and she had. Countless American soldiers, piecing back together bodies that had been torn apart by bullets, shrapnel, and the impersonal machinery of industrial warfare. She was good at her job, efficient and skilled, but she'd learned to maintain an emotional distance because to feel too much was to break. In October of 1945, Dr. Morgan found herself in Nagasaki, treating survivors of the atomic bombing. The injuries she encountered there defied anything in her medical training, burns that went beyond 4th degree, that had essentially cooked tissue all the way to the bone, radiation sickness that caused hair to fall out, blood to refuse to clot, organs to simply shut down, children with keloid scars that covered half their bodies, who would never look normal again, who flinched at the sight of their own reflections. The temptation to see these people as the enemy, as somehow deserving of their suffering because of Pearl Harbor, because of Bataan, because of the countless atrocities committed by Japanese forces throughout Asia, was immense. But Dr. Morgan had not become a doctor to make moral judgments. She had become a doctor to heal. One patient in particular broke through her professional detachment. A young woman named Sachiko, 19 years old, had been less than 2 miles from the hypocenter of the blast. She'd survived, barely, but the radiation had destroyed her bone marrow, and she was slowly bleeding to death from the inside. Her gums bled, her nose bled, any slight bump produced massive bruises. She had perhaps 2 weeks to live, and she knew it. Sachiko spoke some English. She'd studied it in school before the war, when America and Japan had still been at peace. She used this English to thank Dr. Morgan for trying to help, even though they both knew there was nothing to be done. The blood transfusions were temporary measures. The vitamins and medications treated symptoms, not causes. Sachiko was dying, and there was no stopping it. On her final night, Sachiko asked Dr. Morgan to sit with her. The ward was dark, lit only by a few kerosene lamps that cast long shadows. Outside, the ruins of Nagasaki stretched for miles, a monument to humanity's capacity for destruction. "Doctor," Sachiko whispered in halting English, "why do you help us? We were your enemy. We killed your people." Dr. Morgan, exhausted beyond measure, answered with an honesty that surprised even herself. "Because you're a 19-year-old girl who should be falling in love and arguing with her parents and figuring out what to do with her life, not dying in a hospital bed. And because if I stop seeing you as a person deserving of care, then the war has destroyed something in me that I can't get back." Sachiko smiled, a small, sad smile. "You are kind," she said. I think maybe the propaganda was wrong about many things." She died 6 hours later with Dr. Morgan holding her hand. And Dr. Morgan, who had maintained her professional distance through years of war, who had seen so much death that she thought she'd become numb to it, wept for this girl she barely knew, this former enemy who had deserved so much more than the hand that history had dealt her. The psychological impact of the occupation on the American soldiers themselves was profound and largely unexpected. Many had enlisted or been drafted with a clear understanding of the enemy. The Japanese were cruel, fanatical, inhuman. This understanding had been necessary to sustain them through the brutal fighting, to allow them to kill without being destroyed by guilt. But now, ordered to help these same people, forced to see them not as abstract enemies, but as individuals, hungry children, grieving mothers, wounded soldiers who looked and bled and suffered just like everyone else. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. Some soldiers couldn't make the adjustment. They remained locked in hatred, saw compassion as weakness or betrayal of their fallen comrades. Some drank themselves into oblivion each night, trying to reconcile their actions with their beliefs. Some simply shut down emotionally, going through the motions without engagement. But many, perhaps most, underwent a transformation but similar to Sergeant Mitchell's. They discovered, often to their own surprise, that hate is exhausting, that carrying rage is a burden that becomes heavier with each passing day, and that there is a profound relief in setting that burden down. Private First Class Robert Chen, a Chinese-American soldier from San Francisco, whose extended family had suffered under Japanese occupation in China, had perhaps more reason than most to hate. His grandfather had been killed by Japanese soldiers in Nanjing. His aunt had been forced into sexual slavery. His cousins had starved during the occupation. He'd enlisted specifically to kill Japanese soldiers, and he'd done so efficiently and without remorse throughout the island campaigns. In December of 1945, Chen found himself assigned to help rebuild a school in Yokohama. It was menial labor, clearing rubble, sorting salvageable materials,
helping Japanese workers reconstruct walls and roofs. He did it because it was his assignment, not because he cared about Japanese children having a place to learn, but children are relentlessly curious and remarkably resilient.
The kids from the neighborhood would come to watch the reconstruction, fascinated by the foreign soldiers, by the machinery and tools, by the simple fact of something being built rather than destroyed. They kept their distance at first, wary, but gradually crept closer. One boy, bolder than the others, approached Chen directly. He was perhaps 10 years old, skinny as a rail, with a gap-toothed smile and eyes that sparkled with intelligence. He watched Chen work for several minutes, then, in halting English, learned from somewhere, asked. Quote 16. Chen, startled, didn't answer immediately. The boy waited patiently, and something about his earnest expression, his genuine confusion, made Chen set down his hammer and really look at this child. He was just a kid. He hadn't invaded China. He hadn't killed Chen's grandfather. He was just a kid who wanted to go to school. Quote 17. Chen said slowly, finding the words as he spoke them. Quote 18. The boy considered this seriously. Hono. Quote 19. He promised. Fio. Quote 20. It was such a child's promise, so earnest and impossible and pure. Chen felt something crack in his chest, some wall he'd built around his heart to protect himself from feeling too much. Quote 21, he said quietly. Quote 22. From that day on, Chen worked differently, not just to complete an assignment, but to build something good. And when the school was finished and the children filed in for their first day of classes, Chen stood outside and watched and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. By 1946, the transformation was well underway.
Japan hadn't become a democracy overnight, hadn't suddenly embraced all American values, hadn't erased centuries of cultural identity. But something fundamental had shifted. The children who had received chocolate from American soldiers, who had been saved by American doctors, who had learned that the propaganda had been lies, were growing up with a different understanding of the world. These children would become the architects of post-war Japan. They would remember the kindness shown to them in their most vulnerable moment, and that memory would shape their choices, their values, their vision for their nation's future. They would build a democracy, flawed, yes, imperfect, certainly, but a democracy nonetheless. They would forge an alliance with the United States that would become one of the strongest and most enduring in modern history. General MacArthur, for all his faults, understood this. In a letter to President Truman in March of 1946, he wrote, "The money we spend feeding Japanese children today will save us billions in military expenditure tomorrow. Every meal we provide, every life we save, every school we rebuild is an investment in peace that will pay dividends long after all of us are gone." He was right. The Marshall Plan in Europe tends to receive more historical attention, but the American occupation of Japan was equally transformative, equally revolutionary in its approach to post-war reconstruction. The United States had the opportunity to punish, to extract revenge, to leave Japan as a devastated wasteland as payback for Pearl Harbor and Bataan and countless other atrocities. Instead, America chose to rebuild. That choice was not made purely from altruism. Strategic considerations were paramount. A stable, democratic, pro-American Japan would be a valuable ally in the emerging Cold War struggle against Soviet communism. But strategy alone doesn't explain the individual acts of compassion, the chocolate bars given to hungry children, The surgeries performed on dying soldiers, the patient efforts to rebuild schools and hospitals and infrastructure. Those acts came from something deeper, a recognition, however grudging at first, that the people we've been trained to see as monsters are in fact simply people. That suffering is suffering, regardless of what flag the sufferer salutes. That children are children, whether they speak English or Japanese. That the only way to truly end a war is not merely to cease fighting, but to heal the wounds that war has created. Captain Hiroshi Tanaka returned to his family in Kyoto in February of 1946, walking on legs that Dr. Simmons had told him might never work again. His wife, who had spent 4 months believing him dead, fell into his arms and sobbed with a grief and relief so profound it seemed to come from a place beyond words. His daughter, now 5 years old, stared at this thin stranger with confusion until he knelt down and whispered her name. And then she too was in his arms, clinging to him as if he might disappear again. That night, after his family had finally fallen asleep, Hiroshi sat in the garden of his family's home, miraculously undamaged in the bombing, and tried to make sense of what he'd experienced. Everything he'd believed had been proven false. The emperor was not a god. He'd announced as much in his surrender address. The Americans were not demons. They'd saved Hiroshi's life when they had every reason to let him die. The war, which he'd been told was necessary and righteous, had accomplished nothing except death and destruction on a scale that made a mockery of any claimed moral purpose. He felt unmoored, adrift, as if the foundations of reality itself had been revealed as illusion. But slowly, sitting there in the garden with the cherry trees bare in the winter night, he began to rebuild his understanding of the world. If the propaganda had been lies, then he would value truth. If hatred had led to destruction, then he would choose compassion. If blind obedience had created catastrophe, then he would think critically and question authority. It was a quiet revolution, one taking place in a single man's heart, but it was replicated in millions of Japanese homes that winter. A generation of people who had been lied to, who had sacrificed everything for lies, now facing the task of building something true from the ruins. Hiroshi became a teacher. He spent the next 35 years educating Japanese children about history, real history, not propaganda. He taught them about the war, yes, but also about the occupation, about the Americans who had shown compassion when they could have shown cruelty, about the importance of questioning authority and thinking for oneself. He taught them that strength lies not in the ability to destroy, but in the capacity to build, to forgive, to move forward without forgetting. On August 15, 1980, the 35th anniversary of the surrender, Hiroshi was interviewed by a young journalist for a retrospective article. The journalist, herself born in 1957, had grown up in a Japan that was peaceful, prosperous, democratic. A Japan so transformed from the nation her parents had known that it might as well have been a different country entirely. "Do you ever regret surviving?" she asked him. "Do you ever wish you had died as a soldier with honor rather than being saved by the enemy?" Hiroshi smiled, a small, sad smile that held decades of hard-won wisdom. "Every day for the first year I wished I had died," he admitted. "My survival felt like a betrayal of everything I'd believed, everyone I'd fought beside. But then my daughter started school, and I watched her learn to read and write, watched her grow up in a country at peace, and I realized that survival isn't a betrayal, it's an opportunity. I lived to see my daughter graduate from university, to become a doctor, to dedicate her life to healing others. That wouldn't have happened if I'd swallowed the cyanide capsule in my jacket, and that, I think, is honor enough." Sergeant James Mitchell returned to Iowa in March of 1947. He married his high school sweetheart, bought a farm with his service bonus, had 4 children. He rarely spoke about the war. There was too much there that was too dark, too complicated, too painful to put into words. But he kept a photograph on his desk, a picture taken by a military photographer in Osaka in September of 1945.
showing Mitchell kneeling beside a little Japanese girl with bandaged burns, the girl smiling up at him as she holds a piece of chocolate. His children asked about that photograph many times over the years. Mitchell would always pause, choosing his words carefully. "That's Yuki," he'd say. Quote 29. In 1973, Mitchell received a letter from Japan. It was written in careful English and signed by a woman named Yuki Watanabe. Now Dr. Yuki Watanabe, a burn specialist working at a hospital in Osaka. She had spent years trying to track down the American soldier who had been kind to her when she was a terrified 6-year-old in a destroyed city. And through a combination of military records and pure determination, she'd finally found him. "I write to thank you," the letter said, "for showing me that even in the darkest times kindness exists. Your chocolate bar tasted sweet, but your compassion saved my life in a deeper way than you can know. I became a doctor because I wanted to help people the way you helped me. I have devoted my career to treating burn victims, especially children, because I remember what it was like to be that hurt, that frightened, that certain that the world was full of only pain. And I remember your face, your gentleness, your gift. You showed me that the world also contains goodness." Mitchell wept when he read that letter. He'd carried guilt for decades, guilt about the men he'd killed, the destruction he'd witnessed, the fact that he'd survived when so many hadn't. But here, in this letter from a woman he'd met for perhaps 5 minutes 30 years earlier, was something that felt almost like absolution. They corresponded for the rest of Mitchell's life. He died in 1992, at age 70, surrounded by his children and grandchildren. At his funeral, his eldest daughter read aloud from one of Dr. Watanabe's letters. "Your father was a good man who did a small kindness in a time of great cruelty, and that kindness rippled outward in ways he never imagined. I have treated thousands of patients over my career, and I have tried to show them the same compassion he showed me. That is his legacy." The story of the American occupation of Japan is not a simple tale of good versus evil, of saints and sinners.
It's a complex, messy, deeply human story of people making choices in impossible circumstances, of strategic calculations and spontaneous compassion, of propaganda confronting reality and reality winning, slowly and painfully, one interaction at a time. There were failures, certainly. The occupation was far from perfect. There were incidents of assault, of abuse of power, of American soldiers who couldn't or wouldn't set aside their hatred. There were Japanese who remained locked in resentment, who saw American kindness as a form of humiliation more unbearable than cruelty would have been. The road to reconciliation was rocky and uneven, marked by setbacks and frustrations. But the overwhelming trajectory was toward healing, and that healing was made possible not by grand gestures or political declarations, but by thousands of individual acts of humanity. A chocolate bar given to a hungry child, a surgery performed on a dying enemy, a school rebuilt from rubble, a hand extended in friendship rather than clenched in a fist. The children who received that chocolate, who survived because of American medical care, who grew up knowing that the propaganda had been lies, built modern Japan. They created a democracy that has endured for more than 75 years. They forged an alliance with the United States that has become a cornerstone of stability in East Asia. They proved that enemies can become friends, that war's wounds can heal, that reconciliation is possible if both sides choose humanity over hatred. In the end, perhaps that's the most radical lesson of the occupation, that the future is not determined by the past, that cycles of violence that can be broken, that the choice to be kind, even when kindness seems naive or undeserved, can literally change the world. The chocolate bars distributed by American soldiers in the summer and fall of 1945 weren't just food.
They were symbols, tangible evidence that the propaganda had been wrong, that the supposed demons were human, that a different future was possible. They tasted sweet, yes, but they also tasted like hope, like tomorrow, like the possibility of something better emerging from the ashes of catastrophe. And in the end, that's exactly what happened.